Andrea Bocelli's voice has moved millions to tears across the globe. Yet the man behind one of music's most beautiful sounds experienced a tragedy that most people never knew about. At the height of his career, when he should have been celebrating his greatest achievements, he faced a moment that threatened to end everything. This is the story of loss, resilience, and the hidden pain behind the world's most celebrated tenor. What you're about to learn will change how you hear his music forever. Andrea Bocelli was born on September 22, 1958, in a small village called Lajatico in Tuscany, Italy. His parents gave him a gift that most people would never understand. His mother, Eddie, was a pianist. His father, Sandro, was a farmer who loved music with a passion that burned through his entire life. From the moment Andrea was born, his father played classical music in the farmhouse. Puccini, Verdi, Pavarotti. The greatest voices ever recorded filled every room. But Andrea Bocelli was born with congenital glaucoma. This rare eye condition meant his vision was always limited, always fragile. By age 12, after a soccer ball struck him in the face during a match, he lost his sight completely. Complete darkness. No warning. No goodbye to the world he had seen. Most families would have fallen apart. His family chose differently. His father took his hand and said something that would echo through the rest of his life: "Your eyes may not work, but your voice will speak for millions." Andrea believed him. He studied music at the Conservatory of Music in Pisa. He learned piano. He learned composition. But most importantly, he learned that his voice was different. It carried something rare. Something that made people stop breathing when they heard it. In 1992, at age 34, Andrea Bocelli recorded his first album. Nobody expected much from an unknown, blind Italian tenor from a small village. The world was not waiting for him. But his voice changed that calculation instantly. By 1995, his album, Romanza, had sold over 3 million copies worldwide. Radio stations that had never played opera before started broadcasting his songs. People who had never cared about classical music found themselves crying in their cars. He performed at the Olympic Games. He sang at the Grammy Awards. He shared stages with Celine Dion, Sarah Brightman, and Luciano Pavarotti himself. The blind boy from Tuscany had become a global phenomenon. His net worth eventually reached over $50 million. Concert tickets sold out in minutes. Every performance was a standing ovation. Yet behind the applause, behind the sold-out stadiums and the tears of millions, there was a darkness that Andrea Bocelli carried silently. A weight that grew heavier with every passing year. A secret that tested his faith, his family, and everything he believed about life itself. But what he would face next would make all of his previous struggles seem small by comparison. Andrea Bocelli married Enrica Senzati in 1992, the same year he recorded his first album. They had 2 children together, Amos, born in 1995, and Matteo, born in 1997. On the surface, it looked like a perfect life. A talented musician. A loving wife. 2 beautiful sons. The dream that every parent imagines when they hold their newborn child for the first time. But in 1997, something happened that changed the trajectory of their family forever. Matteo Bocelli was born with the same eye condition that had taken Andrea's sight decades earlier. Congenital glaucoma. The same rare disease. The same cruel inheritance. The same darkness that had defined Andrea's entire life was now waiting in the eyes of his infant son. Andrea knew exactly what this meant. He had lived it. He understood every struggle that lay ahead. Every moment of fear. Every adjustment. Every time his son would have to explain to strangers why he couldn't see. He knew the weight of it because he had carried that weight since he was 12 years old. For years, Andrea and Enrica kept this private. They did not grant interviews about Matteo's condition. They did not speak publicly about their pain. While Andrea performed in front of thousands of screaming fans, while cameras flashed and critics praised his voice as a gift from God, he went home to a reality that most people never saw. He went home to a son who was experiencing the same battle he had fought his entire life. The grief was different this time. When Andrea lost his sight as a boy, he had to mourn his own future. But now, as a father, he had to watch his child face that same mourning. He had to find words of comfort when he knew exactly how hard the road would be. He had to be strong for Matteo while carrying his own heartbreak. During this same period, Andrea and Enrica's marriage began to fracture under the weight of their shared pain. Some relationships grow stronger during crisis. Others break under the pressure. Theirs eventually reached a breaking point. In 2002, after 10 years of marriage, they separated. By 2010, their divorce was finalized. But the story does not end there. Because what happened next would test Andrea's character in ways that even his blindness had not. In 2011, Andrea Bocelli married Veronica Berti, a woman 25 years younger than him. This marriage surprised many people. Critics questioned it. Tabloids speculated. But Andrea had found love again, and he chose to embrace it fully. By 2012, Veronica gave birth to their daughter, Virginia. For a brief moment, it seemed like Andrea might finally have the peace he deserved. A new marriage. A new child. A fresh beginning after years of pain and divorce. Then, on February 5, 2012, everything shifted in a single moment that would echo through the rest of his life. Andrea's son Amos, who was 17 years old, was involved in a car accident in Tuscany. The details were kept private by the family, but the reality was devastating. Amos suffered severe injuries. He was rushed to the hospital. For days, the outcome was uncertain. Would he survive? What would his quality of life be? These are the questions that torture a parent's mind when their child hovers between life and death. Andrea sat in that hospital waiting room with the same helplessness he had felt as a child when his own sight was slipping away. He could not sing his son back to health. His voice, which had moved millions to tears, could not change what had happened. His fame meant nothing in that moment. His wealth meant nothing. He was simply a father watching his child suffer. But Amos survived. The accident did not take his life, though it changed him profoundly. The physical recovery was brutal. The emotional recovery was even harder. A 17-year-old boy had to rebuild his entire understanding of what his body could do. What made this tragedy even more complex was that it happened during one of the most important periods of Andrea's career. He was preparing for major performances. The world was waiting for him. But his son needed him more. This was the choice that every parent dreads: your career or your child. Your obligations to millions or your obligation to the one person who matters most. Andrea chose his son. He stepped back from public life. He canceled performances. He sat in hospital rooms instead of concert halls. He was present for the person who needed him most, even though the world was calling him to do something else entirely. Few people knew the real depth of his struggle during those months. The public saw a successful musician. His family knew a man breaking under the weight of almost unbearable pain. Yet this tragedy would eventually lead to something unexpected. After Amos's accident, Andrea Bocelli changed. Not just as a person, but as an artist. The pain he had carried his entire life, his own blindness, his son's blindness, his failed marriage, now his son's near-fatal accident, all of it began to pour into his music in ways that had never happened before. He returned to performing, but something was different. His voice carried a new depth. Critics and fans alike noticed it. It was as if he had descended into the darkest parts of human suffering and returned with an understanding that only comes from surviving genuine tragedy. His performances became less about technical perfection and more about raw emotional truth. In 2013, just 1 year after Amos's accident, Andrea released the album Passion. It was a departure from his previous work. Gone were some of the polished, orchestral arrangements. In their place was something more intimate, more honest. Songs about longing, about loss, about the human heart breaking and somehow continuing to beat anyway. But what people did not know was that Andrea was still processing his own grief while creating this album. He was a man who had lost his sight, watched his son lose his sight, survived a divorce, nearly lost his son to a car accident, and was now trying to make sense of it all through music. The wonder is not that the album was good. The wonder is that he could function at all. During this same period, Andrea made a decision that shocked many people in the music industry. He decided to be more open about Matteo's blindness. Not in a way that exploited his son's condition, but in a way that brought awareness and hope to other families facing the same struggle. He began speaking about his son in interviews. He allowed his son to be photographed. He transformed his private pain into public purpose. This was not an easy choice. It meant opening his family to scrutiny. It meant exposing his son to the world's judgment. But it also meant that other families who felt alone in their struggles could see that blindness did not have to define a life. That a blind child could grow up surrounded by love and possibility. That tragedy could become a bridge to help others. Matteo, now a young man, has spoken about his own journey with remarkable maturity. He has said that his father's example taught him that limitations are only as real as you allow them to be. That the blind boy from Tuscany who became a world-famous singer proved something that many people need to hear, that your circumstances do not determine your destiny. But the story does not end with acceptance and healing. Because there was one more revelation that Andrea had kept hidden for years. For decades, Andrea Bocelli carried a secret that very few people knew. While he was performing in front of millions, while he was being celebrated as one of the greatest voices of our time, he was also a man of deep faith who questioned everything. He struggled with doubt. He wrestled with why God would take his sight. He wondered why his son would inherit the same condition. He asked himself why tragedy kept finding his family. In 2018, Andrea made a surprising announcement. He revealed that he had undergone surgery that had partially restored his vision. Not completely. Not enough to see as most people see. But enough to perceive light and shadow. Enough to see the faces of his children more clearly than he had in decades. Enough to watch a sunset, even if it was blurred and incomplete. The world celebrated this news as a miracle. But Andrea knew the truth. This was not a new development. His vision had been partially restored years earlier, after the accident that took his sight when he was a child. He had been living with partial sight for most of his life, but he had chosen not to tell anyone. He had let the world believe he was completely blind because, in many ways, it was easier. It was a clearer narrative. A more powerful story. A blind man who became the world's greatest tenor. Why did he keep this secret? Because the truth is more complicated than the story. Because admitting partial sight would require him to explain years of silence. Because sometimes the narrative we create about ourselves becomes more real than the actual truth. But there was something deeper happening here. Andrea was learning a lesson that only comes through suffering, that honesty matters more than perfection. That vulnerability is stronger than invincibility. That telling the truth, even when it complicates the story, is the only way to truly connect with other people. In 2023, Andrea went even further. He sat down and spoke openly about his entire journey. The blindness, the divorce, Amos's accident, Matteo's condition, the years of private struggle behind the public success. He did not do interviews seeking sympathy. Instead, he spoke like a man who had finally made peace with his story. He said something that resonates with anyone who has suffered: "My blindness taught me to see in a different way. It taught me to listen. It taught me to feel. And most importantly, it taught me that the greatest gift is not the ability to see with your eyes, but the ability to see with your heart." This was not the statement of a man defeated by tragedy. This was the testimony of someone who had transformed his pain into purpose. Yet the most important part of his story was still to come. By 2024, Andrea Bocelli had become more than just a singer. He had become a symbol of something that the world desperately needs: proof that broken people can create beauty. That suffering can be transformed into art that heals others. That a man who lost his sight could help millions of people see more clearly. His son Matteo, now in his 20s, has followed his father into music. He is a tenor as well. But what makes Matteo's story remarkable is that he did not become a musician because his father was famous. He became a musician because his father showed him that blindness was not a barrier to greatness. That limitations could become strengths. That the same condition that took his sight could also sharpen his other senses in ways that most people never experience. In 2023, Andrea and Matteo performed together publicly for the first time. Father and son, both blind, both tenors, sharing a stage in front of thousands of people. There was not a dry eye in the audience. This was not just a musical performance. This was a statement about resilience, about legacy, about what happens when tragedy becomes a teacher instead of a destroyer. Andrea has also become an advocate for blindness awareness and disability rights. He has donated millions to organizations that help blind children around the world. He has used his platform to change how society views disability. He has shown that a blind person can achieve anything a sighted person can achieve, and often achieve it better because they have learned to see in ways that others never will. But perhaps the most important legacy is the one that happens in living rooms and hospitals around the world. When a parent receives a diagnosis that their child is blind, they often think of Andrea Bocelli. They think of a man who lost his sight and still became one of the greatest singers of all time. They think of hope. They think of possibility. They think that maybe, just maybe, their child's life will not be defined by limitation. This is the real power of his story. Not that he overcame blindness, but that he showed the world that blindness does not need to be overcome. It needs to be understood. It needs to be accepted. And once it is accepted, it can become a source of extraordinary strength. Andrea Bocelli's voice has moved millions to tears. But his life, his actual life, with all its pain and struggle and heartbreak, has inspired millions more. The heartbreaking news that shaped his journey became the foundation of his greatest achievement: not a perfect career, but a meaningful life. A life that proved that our deepest wounds can become our greatest gifts. When you listen to Andrea Bocelli sing now, you are not just hearing a beautiful voice. You are hearing the voice of a man who has suffered and survived. You are hearing someone who understands grief, loss, and the human capacity to transform pain into beauty. And that is why his music will continue to move people long after his voice is silent. Thank you for watching this story of resilience, heartbreak, and the power of the human spirit. If you found strength in stories like Andrea's, please subscribe because the next story on this channel reveals something even more surprising about an artist who refused to let tragedy define them. What story would you like to hear next? Let me know in the comments below.